It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. The kind of morning where everything feels calm, peaceful, and routine. Birds chirping, a soft breeze brushing past the trees, and the sunlight glinting off my driveway. But that serenity shattered in an instant. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through my phone, completely unaware that my day was about to take an insane turn. That's when I heard it, a loud, high-pitched yelling coming from the street. Peeking through the window, I saw her, a middle-aged woman, face red, eyes blazing, gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. She was the classic Karen stereotype come to life, furious, loud, and utterly convinced she was in the right. And all of this chaos? It was over my driveway. Yes, my driveway. Apparently, it was too long, too short, or maybe it just existed in her line of sight too much for her liking. I couldn't tell. What I did know was that she had made a bold decision. She was calling 911. The phone rang. The dispatcher's calm voice drifted through, but I could hear Karen's yelling even from inside my house. Yes, I need someone here immediately. There's a car blocking the driveway, she shouted, waving her arms like she was conducting an invisible orchestra of chaos. Every word she spoke seemed louder than the last, like she was determined to bend reality to her version of order. I set down my coffee, stunned. My neighbors, peeking from behind their curtains, were already starting to gather. You could feel the tension rising, thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, the moment that would flip this entire situation on its head, I stepped outside. Calm. Composed. Dressed in my police uniform. Badge gleaming under the morning sun. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, shaking slightly. She had called 911, on the police chief of her own neighborhood. The chaos on her face was priceless, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and outright panic. In that split second, the entire dynamic changed. The energy shifted from her attacking me to her trying to survive the consequences of her actions. And I just stood there, arms crossed, savoring the moment, knowing that she had no idea what had just hit her. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. What happened next would escalate beyond anything either of us could have imagined. The instant she realized who she was yelling at, Karen froze. Her hands trembled, phone still pressed to her ear, as if holding it would somehow shield her from the truth. Her eyes darted around wildly, scanning for witnesses, for escape, for some miraculous loophole that could save her from the embarrassment she was now steeped in. But there was none. Not a single one. I could see the gears turning in her head, panic colliding with fury. This wasn't just an angry neighbor anymore, it was someone facing the reality that they had just made a colossal mistake. And of course, she wasn't going to let it go quietly. Karen's voice, once full of rage and confidence, wavered, then cracked, then rose again. I didn't know. I thought. I mean, someone needs to deal with this. Her argument was fragmented, desperate, and comically incoherent, but the tension in the air made it feel like a high-stakes confrontation. The neighbors, who had initially peeked from their windows out of curiosity, now whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others snickered quietly. Everyone could see the unfolding drama, and the combination of fear and embarrassment on Karen's face was mesmerizing. I didn't move. I just stood there, calm, arms folded, letting the situation unfold. I knew better than to immediately intervene in her panic. Letting her stew, letting her flounder, was far more effective than any stern words I could say. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Then she tried to justify herself. Well, you see, your driveway, it's in the way, and I had no other choice. Her words tumbled out, tangled, contradictory, and utterly useless. I could almost hear her brain trying to assemble an excuse while her ego screamed in terror. It was in that moment I noticed something else. The small crowd had grown. Neighbors came out with phones, recording, whispering, some trying to hide their smiles. Her panic amplified. Each glance she gave at the growing audience made her more frantic, more desperate. The fact that this interaction was now public knowledge added a new layer of humiliation she clearly hadn't anticipated. And then came the silent pause, the kind that feels like it stretches for eternity. Karen realized something critical. The narrative she had planned in her mind, the one where she was the victim calling 911, had completely collapsed. She wasn't in control anymore. She was facing the very authority she had mocked, in her own neighborhood, with witnesses all around. Her next move would determine if she tried to salvage her dignity or dig the hole deeper. Karen's panic had reached a fever pitch, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. She straightened her posture as best she could, puffed out her chest, and attempted to reclaim the upper hand. Her voice quivered, but the determination to appear authoritative was evident. You can't just stand there. This is harassment. I demand." Her sentence faltered mid-word, cut off by the incredulous looks of the neighbors gathering nearby. Some shook their heads, others whispered behind their phones, recording every moment. The scene had transformed from a private quarrel to a public spectacle, and Karen hadn't anticipated an audience. Her sense of control was slipping like sand through her fingers. I stepped forward slightly, maintaining a calm and deliberate pace. Each movement measured, professional. There was no anger, no irritation, just authority. The badge on my chest gleamed in the morning sunlight, a silent reminder of the truth she was refusing to face. I let her words wash over me, nodding slowly, letting the tension rise while projecting calm control. "You called 911, over a driveway," I finally said, my voice even but firm. "I understand you're upset, but escalating it in this manner isn't how we handle disputes." I paused, giving her a moment to process. Her jaw tightened, eyes darting around, and I could see the realization forming that she had crossed a line. Karen tried again, louder this time. But it's blocking, it's wrong. Someone has to do something." Her gestures were frantic, waving toward my driveway like a conductor directing a non-existent orchestra. But the words fell flat, hollow in the face of undeniable authority. I took a small step closer, not threatening, just asserting presence. "I'm here to ensure order, not to argue with neighbors. If there's a legitimate concern, it can be addressed civilly, not through panic calls and public scenes." The quiet power in my tone seemed to shake her further. She blinked rapidly, mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to counter my calm. Her panic was contagious, in a strange way, but not to me, rather, to the energy of the street. The neighbors sensed the shift. The woman who had started with fury was now clearly flustered, unsure, and realizing that the situation had completely escaped her control. And then came the moment of truth, a beat where she realized that calling the police chief on a personal whim wasn't just a mistake, it was an embarrassment she couldn't undo. Every muscle in her face screamed it. And everyone watching knew it too. This confrontation, which had begun as a minor annoyance over a driveway, had spiraled into something unforgettable. Karen's panic was no longer subtle, it had fully bloomed into a chaotic storm. Her hands shook as she gripped her phone, the device now trembling like a lifeline slipping from her fingers. The neighbors' whispers had grown louder, and a few cameras were pointed directly at her. Every eye on the street amplified her embarrassment, and it was evident she hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny. Her voice cracked as she tried to justify herself again. I just your driveway, it's a problem." The words barely made sense, a frantic jumble of half-thoughts and incoherent logic. She was grasping at anything to salvage credibility, but in reality, she was sinking deeper with every passing second. I stayed calm, hands folded, letting her flounder. My presence alone projected authority, and the contrast between her chaos and my composure could not have been starker. I glanced around at the neighbors, some smiled, others shook their heads, and a few simply filmed, capturing this unforgettable neighborhood spectacle. The entire energy of the street had shifted. Karen, the instigator, was now the center of everyone's silent judgment. She took a step backward, tripping slightly over the edge of the driveway, her balance precarious. Her mouth opened and closed, and she looked like she was about to cry, but not from sadness. This was frustration, humiliation, and sheer panic mixed into a volatile cocktail. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone watching, someone calling 911 over a driveway, only to realize they were confronting the police chief himself. The quiet tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. I could see her thoughts spinning, searching desperately for a solution that didn't exist. Then she did something telling. She lowered her gaze, avoided eye contact, her bravado crumbling. Karen's moment of reckoning had arrived. This wasn't just a minor neighborhood dispute anymore. She had painted herself into a corner, and the walls were closing in. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some chuckling quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Every gesture, every flail, every frustrated gasp from Karen reinforced the story: she had underestimated the situation and me. What began as a petty annoyance over a driveway had now transformed into a full-blown social spectacle, a lesson in authority and composure. And the irony was delicious. She had called 911 thinking she was wielding power, but in reality, she had just highlighted her own vulnerability in front of everyone. The situation was escalating, and I knew this was just the beginning of the chain of events that would leave her and the neighborhood talking for weeks. Little did she know, the next move she made could make or break her already crumbling dignity. By now, the entire block had gathered. Windows were open, front doors ajar, and cameras in hand. Karen's actions, once a private annoyance, had become the main event of the neighborhood. The whispers, chuckles, and pointed stares formed a silent jury. Every movement she made was amplified in their collective gaze, and I could see the effect it had on her. Her face, once flushed with anger, now flickered between shock, panic, and embarrassment. She took another step back, almost tripping over the edge of the driveway again. Her phone slipped slightly in her grasp, and she scrambled to steady it, muttering incoherent fragments about rules, fairness, and someone needing to intervene. But the words fell flat. The more she tried to regain control, the more obvious it became that she was losing. Her desperation radiated from her every pore. I decided to address the growing crowd, speaking calmly but with authority. Neighbors, please, this situation is being handled. There's no need for speculation or interference. Let's resolve this civilly. The subtle firmness in my tone seemed to both reassure the bystanders and reinforce to Karen that she was completely outmatched. Karen, however, was not ready to surrender. She straightened, taking a shaky breath, and attempted to reclaim her authority, or at least her dignity. I just want what's right. That driveway it's unfair, she stammered. The words lacked conviction, and everyone could sense it. She was performing for an audience she didn't know how to impress. At that moment, one of the neighbors, a middle-aged man with a quiet sense of amusement, stepped forward. He didn't speak harshly, but his subtle smirk said everything. The absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. Karen noticed, flinched, and her confidence cracked further. The social pressure was now working against her. Every bystander's eyes seemed to silently judge her judgment, reinforcing the reality she had tried to avoid. I remained calm, arms folded, letting her flounder while the neighbors' reactions amplified the tension. It was clear she had never anticipated this level of attention. Her ego, once so sure and aggressive, was now teetering on the edge of total collapse. Then came the inevitable realization. Karen finally understood that calling 911 against a police chief in her own neighborhood was more than a simple error. It was a public display of poor judgment, and everyone could see it. Her breathing grew shallow, panic rising in waves, and it was clear she had no idea how to recover. The stage was set. Karen had a choice: attempt a graceful retreat, or continue digging herself deeper into humiliation. Karen's panic had escalated to a point where words alone couldn't express her frustration. Her face was a chaotic mix of disbelief, embarrassment, and sheer desperation. Every flailing hand, every sharp intake of breath, every frantic glance at the neighbors highlighted the fact that she had completely lost control of the situation. She had expected compliance, fear, or at least acknowledgement of her self-imposed authority, but none of that had happened. Instead, she faced a reality that was painfully inescapable. She had called 911 on the police chief of her own neighborhood. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Neighbors whispered, cameras caught every second, and some even stifled quiet laughter. The streets had transformed into a stage, and Karen was unknowingly performing the role of the panicked antagonist. Meanwhile, I remained calm, composed, and immovable, every motion measured, every word deliberate. The calmness only emphasized the chaos surrounding her, turning the entire spectacle into a silent lesson in authority and composure. She tried again, louder, with more aggression. This is harassment. It's unfair. You need to. Her words stumbled, fragmented by the panic swelling inside her. The phone trembled in her hand as she attempted to maintain control, but it was clear she was failing spectacularly. Her earlier confidence had evaporated completely. I took a deliberate step closer, the sunlight glinting off my badge, and spoke with firm composure. The situation is being handled. If there's a genuine concern, it should be addressed civilly. Yelling and calling emergency services unnecessarily will not solve anything. My tone was calm but carried weight, a gentle but undeniable assertion of authority. Her eyes widened as the realization sank in. The words hit harder than any argument she could muster. This wasn't just a minor misunderstanding anymore, it was a public exposure of her misjudgment. Her mouth opened and closed, struggling for a comeback that didn't exist. Then came the silent pause, the kind that stretches uncomfortably in moments of embarrassment. Karen's energy shifted, the aggression drained, replaced by panic-fueled anxiety. Her gaze darted everywhere except mine, finally settling on the gathered neighbors, whose expressions silently mirrored her defeat. In that moment, the tipping point was reached. Karen's ego, once a blazing storm of confidence, had collapsed under the weight of reality. She had created a spectacle, and now she was trapped inside it. Every choice she made from here on would only determine how far her humiliation could go. The stage was set for what would happen next, a decisive moment where calm authority would meet chaotic panic, and the outcome would be unforgettable. The tension had reached a palpable peak. Karen's attempts to maintain composure were failing entirely. Her voice cracked with frustration and panic, and her hands trembled visibly as she gripped the phone tighter than ever. Every flailing motion, every sharp intake of breath, seemed amplified under the watchful eyes of the neighbors who now surrounded the scene. What began as a simple dispute over a driveway had escalated into a full-blown spectacle that no one could ignore. Her words were erratic, fragmented, and contradictory. This driveway. You can't. Someone must. She paused mid-sentence, as if her brain had finally recognized the futility of her words. The crowd of neighbors was silent now, all waiting for the inevitable next move. Their attention only heightened her anxiety. I remained composed, arms crossed, standing tall in my uniform, a symbol of authority amidst the chaos. My presence alone was enough to emphasize the contrast between her frantic energy and my calm control. It was a subtle power play, one she could feel but could not counter. Every tense glance, every whispered comment from the crowd reinforced her diminishing sense of control. Then came the moment of undeniable recognition, the moment she fully grasped the reality of her actions. Her eyes widened as she realized she had called 911 on the police chief of her own neighborhood. The sheer absurdity of it, coupled with the public exposure, hit her like a tidal wave. Her face went pale, and for a brief second, she froze, phone still clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Some neighbors tried to suppress laughter, others exchanged looks of disbelief, and a few even discreetly filmed her meltdown. Karen's pride had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of humiliation. Every frantic gesture, every desperate word only reinforced the lesson she was learning the hard way: actions have consequences, and in this case, the consequences were immediate and public. I took a calm step forward and spoke in a steady, authoritative tone. The situation is clear. There's no need for panic. If there's a legitimate concern, it can be addressed appropriately. Calling emergency services for personal grievances isn't the solution. My words were firm but not threatening, projecting a quiet control that further unbalanced her. Karen's frantic energy now teetered on the edge of total collapse. Her breathing quickened, her words fell into stammers, and the reality of her misjudgment sank in. The chaos she had created was now entirely hers to bear, and everyone watching could see it. In that moment, the confrontation had reached its climax, the peak of tension, humiliation, and authority. What would happen next? That decision, that small movement, would define the remainder of this unforgettable encounter. The air was thick with anticipation. Karen's frantic energy had finally begun to crumble, replaced by a heavy mix of embarrassment and disbelief. Her initial fury had evaporated, leaving behind the stark reality of her mistake. She had called 911 over something trivial, only to discover she was confronting the police chief himself. The crowd of neighbors, once mere witnesses, had now become an unspoken jury. Every eye on the street was fixed on her, magnifying the weight of her actions. Karen tried to regain some semblance of control, but the effort was futile. She stammered, I didn't know. I thought. Her voice trailed off, drowned out by the murmurs of the audience and the unmistakable calm authority emanating from me. Each pause, each failed attempt at justification only served to highlight her vulnerability further. I took a measured step forward, projecting calm authority without aggression. Calling 911 for personal grievances is not appropriate, I said evenly. If there's an issue, it can be addressed civilly and respectfully. This situation, however, demonstrates why escalation without reason can lead to public embarrassment and unnecessary conflict. My words were deliberate, each one striking a balance between firmness and impartiality. Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red. Her hands shook as she gripped her phone, realizing that the dramatic display she had intended had completely backfired. The neighbors, many still recording, whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The social pressure had reached a point where even her bravest defenses could not hold. The turning point came when she finally lowered her phone, her body language shifting from defiance to reluctant acknowledgement. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly, and her eyes flicked nervously toward me. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. What she had assumed would be a confrontation in her favor had now become a lesson in humility and perspective. At this moment, a few neighbors cautiously approached, offering tentative smiles and whispered remarks. Some tried to diffuse the tension with small jokes, while others simply observed. Karen, now aware of the spectacle she had created, seemed trapped in a combination of shame and incredulity. It was clear that this confrontation had left a mark on her, on the street, and on everyone who witnessed it. The drama was far from over, but the intensity had peaked. The next steps would determine whether Karen could salvage any dignity or if this moment would cement her as the unforgettable instigator of the neighborhood incident. The resolution was approaching, and every eye remained fixed, waiting for the final act of this extraordinary encounter. The tension finally began to ease. Karen, still visibly shaken, lowered her phone completely and took a step back from the driveway. The fire that had burned so fiercely in her eyes was now replaced by a flicker of shame and disbelief. The neighbors, who had been silently observing the entire ordeal, let out soft murmurs and even a few suppressed chuckles. The public spectacle had reached its inevitable conclusion. Karen had been completely outmatched, and everyone knew it. I maintained my composure, standing tall in uniform, arms crossed, projecting calm authority. My presence had not only controlled the situation but also served as a subtle lesson in restraint and professionalism. There was no yelling, no anger, just a steady display of control that contrasted sharply with her chaotic behavior. Every movement, every word had reinforced the reality: authority, patience, and composure always trump panic and impulsivity. Karen finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as if even the words she was trying to muster felt heavy with embarrassment. I didn't realize," she trailed off, unable to complete the thought, aware that the weight of her actions and the public attention had left no room for justification. Neighbors began to disperse, some nodding politely, others shaking their heads, clearly having witnessed something extraordinary. The cameras that had been recording were now being tucked away, but the memories of the encounter lingered in the air like an invisible mark on the street. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood had been irrevocably altered, her moment of perceived power replaced by public humility. I finally stepped forward, offering a calm but firm final statement. "Everyone, let this be a reminder: conflicts can and should be resolved respectfully. Escalation through panic or misjudgment only leads to unnecessary embarrassment and stress. It's important to approach disagreements with composure and understanding." My words, measured and deliberate, resonated with the gathered neighbors, reinforcing the lesson of the morning. Karen, still stunned, gave a small nod, the acknowledgement of her mistake clear in her expression. She turned slowly and walked back toward her house, leaving the driveway, the crowd, and the chaos behind her. There was no dramatic exit, no further confrontation, just a quiet retreat, a subtle acceptance of reality. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Yet the story of that morning, the 911 call, the confrontation, and the unforgettable realization would be remembered for weeks. It was a moment of chaos, authority, and human error intertwined in a way that left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. And for me, standing calmly in the driveway, it was a reminder of why composure and professionalism always prevail.